Hello, I'm Dan Chappa, and I'm with Martin Glynn, and we're from the Society of Evangelical Arminians. And I'm just happy to be here and excited to come and talk about Arminian theology and just represent the Society of Evangelical Arminianism in today's episode. Our specific topic is going to be on God's providence, how God cares for the world, how he plans things out. And we'll be looking at some comments that William Lane Craig had in his Defenders class on Arminianism and what he had to say about the Arminian view of providence and how he contrasted that with his own Molinist view of divine providence. So, been excited about this, looking forward to this discussion. Mm-hmm. But before we do, Martin, how have you been?
I've been crazy. Actually, I was just at a wedding, so just a little chaotic this week. So, but I've been good. I've been good.
Well, very good, very good. Well, glad to be here with you. So, we had been chatting a little bit offline, back and forth, a little bit about this topic, and you had pointed out one of William Lane Craig's Defenders classes where he talked about Arminianism. Now, this is not the sum total of everything that he said about Arminianism. No. Yeah. He said quite a bit. Big picture, I think of William Lane Craig as certainly a strong ally to Arminianism in a lot of ways. We can join shoulders with him in his pushback against Calvinism. I liked a lot of the points that he made in this debate against James White. And when he's pushing back on determinism, certainly some of his books where he's written, he's frame things in a nice way. He's disagreeing with Paul Helm on the Calvinist side and maybe open theists on the other side. And so there's a lot of that I can certainly relate to, even if in this video there were some things that he said that I can't quite agree with. So I guess what are your overall big picture thoughts on William Lane Craig and his Defenders ministry and his basically apologetics approach?
It is difficult for me to think of a theologian who is alive at the same time I'm alive, that I'm a bigger fan of than William Lane Craig. So when I was this is back in 2012, my son was sick and he ultimately passed away. And I was going through a lot of difficulties, and that's actually him up there. And very, very rough time for me, very difficult time. And the way that I kind of got through it was listening to William Lane Craig videos, of all things. It was really diving into him. And because of that, I have listened to every single Defenders class he's ever done. I've watched all of his Zondervan videos. I've read most of his books. I'm a huge fan of William Lane Craig, despite the fact that I'm not a Molinist. So even though I'm a big fan of him, I've never felt like I've had to agree with him, and I've been willing to disagree with him on certain things. Big picture of today, of what it is that we're talking about today, is it's not that I view William Lane Craig as an ally to Arminianism, is that I view William Lane Craig as an Arminian, and he just isn't willing to commit to the name. And that's basically what he is, because like in his Defenders class, when he talks about soteriology and he compares the different soteriologies, he starts talking about the Arminian view being the corporate election view, and he says that that's his view. And if he's soteriologically an Arminian, he's an Arminian. That's just what Arminianism is. It's a view on soteriology. So if he agrees on Arminianism, on everything that makes an Arminian, then he's an Arminian. But he is so committed to the Molinist position as being a middle ground between Arminianism and Calvinism that he kind of shies away from the name and instead committing himself to the name Molinist as being the main thing that he is, which, okay, but that he's still an Arminian.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. Yeah. So I look at the question of soteriology in terms of tulip Calvinism versus the 5 points of the Remonstrance, let's say, as the soteriological issue and sphere, and that really determines whether somebody is Arminian or Calvinist or whatever. And then the question of God's foreknowledge and providential control. There's the typical views that you hear out there are determinism, theistic determinism, which is usually the Calvinist position, and then there's middle knowledge, which is William Lane Craig's position. There's the simple foreknowledge view, and then there's also the open theist perspective. And to me, those are kind of separate spheres. I'm not saying that they don't overlap in many significant and important ways. Of course they do, but to classify someone as an Arminian versus a Calvinist or something else, it's Molinism isn't a model of soteriology. The soteriologies are either Arminian or Calvinist, and usually it falls into those camps. I mean, not that there's not other buckets like provisionism or whatever, but there's the soteriological question, and then there's the model of divine providence. And all of William Lane Craig's pushback that I can tell so far has been in the area of the model of providence. And to me, Arminians, they're not determinists. Definitely, we're not determinists, and we're not open theists. But anything else in the middle, is kind of pretty open.
Yeah, and what it is, it's not what is part of the Arminian view of providence, is what is compatible with the Arminian view. So divine determinism is incompatible with Arminianism. But that's not the same thing as saying that an Arminian is not that it just belongs to Arminian to have a particular providential view. That's sort of the mistake. It's just that there are certain providential views that are incompatible with Arminianism.
I like that point. I agree with you. Yeah, what is incompatible? So the specific point of soteriology is irresistible grace, because irresistible to grace just is determinism with respect to conversion. And
I usually focus in on election, but yeah.
Okay, well, fair enough. So I think that there's lots of integrated connections, but it's just so it's not that you're right. So determinism is not going to be compatible with Arminian soteriology because of election, because of irresistible grace, and other things probably also. But those really jump out to me. So yeah, that's cool. So actually, we had a question come in. So Amber, hey Amber. So Amber asks, for the non-Arminian, can you quickly summarize Arminian providence? That's a tough question, because I think there's frankly a spectrum of views. So, okay, if I had to nutshelize it, when you look at the writings of Arminius himself, his model of providence to me is highly dependent on the distinction between God permitting or preventing something. And he explained a lot of passages of scripture and a lot of situations where God exercised providential control in that way. For starters, he made a very clean distinction between permission and prevention. And he criticized the determinist / Calvinist position, saying they collapsed the distinction between God's permission and God's action, because he was saying, well, the Calvinists are going as far as to say God can't even know the future or what's about to happen unless he decrees it, and his decree is the first cause of that, right? And so he's like, well, if God is acting in such a way to secure that which he permits, what's the difference between permission and acting to secure it? Whereas permission is a little bit of a allowing something to happen, allowing another agent to act. So the bottom line is he had a very clean distinction between God's permission and action. He was willing to say that God could prevent pretty much anything, I think, basically anything. But God in his providence sometimes prevents things, and sometimes he permits them. And it was his sovereign choice just to do that. He had good ends in mind. He puts mankind in a situation where he tests them. He wants them to pass the test. Maybe he knows that they won't, and he's going to bring some greater good out of it. But so sometimes he permits evil, but it's a permission, not an action to determine it. So I think, to me, that at least when I read Arminius himself, that's his main model of providence.
Let me use an analogy. Imagine, if you will, that you have a baby. It happens sometimes. And when you have a baby, you can take that child and you can put him on the floor and let him run wild, and then walk into another room and do other things and not pay attention to the baby. Most people would call that foolish or neglectful. So what do? We invented the idea of the playpen. So we take the playpen, we put it in the room, and then what do you do with the playpen? You put a toy here, you put a toy there, you put a whole bunch of things in the playpen, but not anything you can think of, stuff that you think is appropriate for the child. And then you put the child in the playpen, and then you let the child go. You don't determine what the child does within the playpen, but you do determine what's in there. And you can decide when to take the child out, when to put the child in, what to remove, what to take out. So it's not as if like you've completely abandoned the child. You go back and forth to see how they're doing, and you interact with them when you feel that it's necessary, and when you don't feel that it's necessary, you don't. And you don't have to control the child in everything that they do. Like, oh no, you have to play with this now. You just know they're in the playpen. They're taking care of themselves for the most part, and that's kind of the way that it works. Now, what? And again, I'm thinking much more in terms of the simple, and we're not even talking about omniscience here. We're just simply talking about how do Arminians understand the manner in which God intervenes in the world. Does God control a person? No, he doesn't control the person, but he does manipulate things around the person. Absolutely, he does. And so when we're talking about God's predestination, we're talking about what God does around people to ensure certain events and ends occur. But what we don't feel he has to do is directly enter into a person's mind and then manipulate their mind in order to make sure that these certain events happen. He doesn't have to do that. He understands humans too well to like require that to occur. I hope that helps it, Amber.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a great analogy. I appreciated that. So, you ready to listen to a few of the clips we've got lined up for William Lane Craig here?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay. And so this is from his Defenders class, and I've linked it into the description of the show if anyone wants to see the full original. The original, I think, is like about 40 minutes. We're not going to be able to play 40 minutes. We're just going to pick some of the key parts where he's interacting specifically with Arminianism. So let's give this a listen here. So here we go. All right, and I'll apologize in advance if a commercial comes up. Hopefully it won't.
Account of divine sovereignty.
What was that? What? Sorry.
Yeah, that's the second. Well, actually, I don't even think that's the second clip.
Yeah,
I think that's the third clip.
The Arminian account of divine sovereignty and human freedom on the basis of God's foreknowledge of the future. Consider the following biblical passage from Acts chapter 4, verses 27 to 28. For truly in this city there were gathered together against thy holy servant Jesus, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever thy hand and thy plan had predestined to take place. Acts 4, 27 to 28. Now here we have a staggering assertion of divine sovereignty over the affairs of men. The conspiracy to crucify Jesus, which involved not only the Romans, but also the Jews living in Jerusalem at that time, but more particularly by name, Pilate and Herod, who tried Jesus, is said to have happened by God's plan based upon his foreordination. Now, how can the Arminian make sense of so sweeping a sovereignty as this? The proponent of God's simple foreknowledge can make no good sense, I think, of God's providential planning of a world of free creatures in the absence of middle knowledge. On such a view, God has logically, prior to his decree to create a world, only knowledge of all possible scenarios that could happen. But he has no knowledge at all of what would happen under any given circumstances. So even given the circumstances of the existence of the Roman Empire and the Jewish Sanhedrin and Pontius Pilate and Herod in Jerusalem in the first century, God has no idea what these free agents would do in these circumstances. So, logically posterior to God's decree to create a world involving such persons and circumstances, God must consider himself extraordinarily lucky that all of these people did exactly what he wanted them to. We can imagine God saying to himself, "What a break! Pilate and Herod and all those people each did exactly what they were supposed to do." Actually, the situation is even worse than that, because given that the circumstances in which these actions were taken were themselves the result of innumerable prior contingent circumstances, God had no idea whether Herod or Pilate or the Israelite nation or the Roman Empire would even exist prior or posterior to his divine decree to create a world. So God must be astonished to find himself in such a world in which, out of all possible worlds that he might have created, the world exists in which mankind falls into sin, and God sends his only son into human history as a substitutionary sacrificial offering to rescue fallen humanity. Now, of course, I'm speaking anthropomorphically here in describing God's surprise, but the point remains that without middle knowledge, God cannot know prior to his creative decree what the world would be like. If the Arminian goes on to appeal to God's foreknowledge of the future in order to say that God's foreordination of future events is based upon his simple foreknowledge, then this trivializes the doctrine of foreordination or predestination. It makes it a kind of fifth wheel that bears no weight. For if God knows that something will happen, then there's nothing more to foreordain. If it will happen, then it will happen. The future, by definition, is whatever will happen. So if it will happen, it will happen. And foreordination becomes a redundancy. And sure.
Okay, we can pause there. That's a good bit to chew on. So let's. Do you want to go first? I'm sorry, Martin. I can't hear you.
There are two really frustrating things about this particular presentation.
Okay.
First and foremost, the fact that he names this the Arminian view. This is the simple foreknowledge view. Arminianism is simply committed to the idea of libertarian free will. You could be a Molinist and be an Arminian. You can be a simple foreknowledge view and be an Arminian. Some, like Roger Olson, thinks you could be an open theist and be an Arminian. Now, there are questions about whether or not Molinism is compatible with Arminianism. Brian Abashano, which I've been practicing his name, he doesn't think that Molinism is compatible, but most of C does. And Roger Olson thinks that open theism is compatible with Arminianism. I personally don't. But it's a compatibility issue. It's not belonging to Arminianism or not belonging to Arminianism. Arminianism is a soteriological view that merely requires the belief of libertarian free will. That's fundamentally what it is. And that's very, very frustrating that he does that. The other thing that is frustrating is, as someone who holds to a simple foreknowledge view, I don't think his description is accurate at all. And I have several reasons why, but I want to give you the floor before I go into those.
So the first, and in full disclosure, I do consider myself an Arminian Molinist, or at least what Dr. Stratton, Dr. Tim Stratton would describe as a mere Molinist. So I certainly think that God knows what would happen under alternative scenarios other than what's actually happening. And the classic text for that, I think we all know, but like David at Keilah, when he asks, will Saul attack the city? And God tells him he would, but then David leaves, and then so Saul never attacks. So how did God know that if it didn't actually happen? He knew what would happen. Those sorts of things. And there's many other passages. That's not the point. The point is that I do hold that God knows what would happen in various circumstances. Now, I need to caveat that this is strongly as possible that I am an Arminian Molinist, not a Calvinist Molinist. And although they're rare, they are out there. Like I think J.D. Martin might be something like that. But there are some folks out there that hold to libertarian free will, but the tulip in their soteriology. They're not Arminians, they're Calvinists. So that does happen. So I would call myself a mere Molinist in the sense that when William Lane Craig describes it, he describes a fully formed, very organized, logical system of providence. And usually the way he describes it is in the three moments of God's knowledge. God's natural knowledge is God knows what can happen. He knows all the possibilities. So that's the first logical order, not chronological order, but logical order in God's knowledge. Then the second is God knows what would happen under any circumstance. So he knows first what's possible to happen, and then second, he knows, okay, so if Dan were in Timbuktu, he would buy cardamom spice or whatever, right? So he knows these alternative circumstances and what people would do if they were in those circumstances. Then there's a decree where he chooses of all those things of what would happen. They're organized into these possible worlds, feasible worlds or timelines, and God chooses one. And then he knows what will happen, and that's his knowledge of the future. So the way William Lane Craig organizes it is highly systematic. I think a lot of Arminians that I've seen say, well, God does know what would happen under different circumstances. That's very common to hear. What's a little more rare is for an Arminian to go ahead and say, yeah, let's organize this into natural knowledge, middle knowledge, a decree, and free knowledge. And the other point, well, actually, I'll pause there. I have more to say on this topic, but the main point I'd like to get to is that I 100% agree with you. I'm an Arminian Molinist. Molinism, I think, is well within the scope. It seems to fit nicely together with Arminian soteriology. I think it does for Craig also. So I would call him an Arminian Molinist, even if he doesn't want to take the label. He wants to market himself as in between, like the guy in the middle, right? There's Calvinism on this side, there's Arminianism on the other side, and look at me, I'm right in the middle. And
which is exactly what Molina was doing. Molina was an Irenicist. He was attempting to solve the problem and trying to bring people together, which never works. You only ever create a third position when you do that. But that's what he was trying to do. And Craig is trying to live out being Molina. So. Yeah.
Yes. What was Miyagi's quote? If you walk on the left side of the road, you're fine. If you walk on the right side of the road, you're fine. If you walk in the middle, sooner or later, squish, just like grape.
I forgot about that line. I don't remember that line. I have to watch that movie again.
Yeah, it's a great movie. But okay, cool. Yes. So you said there was a second point that you were saying about simple foreknowledge, and I was curious to hear a bit more on that. Like you said that. So, go ahead.
So, like, the biggest problem with simple foreknowledge is that the simple foreknowledge view is stubbornly non-systematic in nature. So the problem that Craig has is that he's trying to take what is by design a vague understanding of things and try to make it specific. And the simple foreknowledge, like my basic view on the relationship between libertarian free will and divine providence and his omniscience and all those other kinds of things is that we don't have sufficient access to any of these things to know what any of them, like how any of them are actually properly working. And therefore, any model that you have, whether it be a Molinism or non-Molinism or whatever, is speculation. We are speculating by nature. This is how I understand the concept of mystery, which is different than how Craig understands it. Because Craig, like he says this in a different Defenders class, I think the one before this one, where he rejects the idea of like he doesn't reject it, but he says mystery is something that you fall back on when you've exhausted all other options. And I don't think that's the way mystery should be used. Mystery is the humble recognition that we don't have enough information to come up with a definite solution. So everything that I'm saying after this point is speculation. So like, for instance, when Amber asked her question earlier, I could give a lot more specifics about my thoughts personally about providence, but I wouldn't describe them as this is the simple foreknowledge position. It'd be, this is my position as a member of the simple foreknowledge position. But the simple foreknowledge position is simply, we don't know. We know that God knows the future. We know that God knows what certain people would do in certain circumstances. It doesn't mean he knows all subjunctives, but he will know, at least he doesn't know some of them. And that it would also stand to reason that there's certain, that when he intervenes, he's taking what he knows into account when he intervenes. And that's basically the extent of it. We just know these things, and how they fit together is just sort of personally decided. It's up to you how you fit them together. And if you fit them together in a Molinist perspective, you're kind of outside of that simple framework because you become much more specific about things. You know, and that's the real problem. Like, he's trying to take something which is by choice vague and make it specific, and then describe, and then say like, and then they must say this and they must say this. No, we don't must say anything. Now, I have certain specifics where I think what basically goes on is that God does know what people will do in other circumstances, but he doesn't know subjunctive people. Like, I have trouble imagining that he knows who Dan Prime would be. Like for instance, let's say your parents conceived a child 10 seconds before you actually were, so now a different person was born than you. They probably still would have named him Daniel, so let's just call him Danny. All right, so now you've got Dan Chapa, who does exist, and Danny Chapa, who is only a theoretical person. He's a subjunctive person. All right. I don't understand how it's meaningful to know what Danny would do. I think that God knows what you would do in any particular circumstance because he knows you. But I don't see how it's meaningful for God to intimately know people who have never existed and will never exist. It'd be like somebody knowing what a unicorn anatomy is. You can know possible unicorn anatomies, and that's fine, but there isn't an actual answer there because the unicorns don't exist. You know, and thus to say that you know what Danny would do, well, there is no Danny. So what exactly is that? And it's even worse if you think about people who, like, other people your parents could have married other than who they did. And it just goes back down the line. What does it mean for these alternate people for God to know who they are? Like, that's what I struggle with. But I have no problem with God knowing exactly what you would do in any particular circumstance because he knows you. He knows you that intimately. And yeah, so
Well, let's take that idea and put it back into the context in which William Lane Craig was discussing it, because he was talking about Acts chapter 4, and that's obviously a very famous text. In fact, here I can put this on the screen. Maybe that would be helpful.
Mhm.
So Acts 4, and I'll read 27 and 28. Then this is Peter's prayer, but okay. For truly in this city they were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. So I guess my question for you is, so you said, you have you're okay with the idea of God knows what Dan Chapel would do in other circumstances because he knows me. So does the same apply to, let's say, Pontius Pilate? And God knew that Pontius Pilate, if pressured by these arguments like, hey, you're not going to be a friend of Caesar if you let him go, or something like that. And so God knows, well, if this argument is presented to Pontius Pilate, he's going to cave. He's going to capitulate and hand Jesus over. Yeah. So in that sense, is your explanation of the text really all that different than William Lane Craig's?
I mean, in some ways, the only difference is that I don't feel a need to go to the beginning of the founding of the world to explain it. So, like when you're talking, right. so like when he starts talking about like, oh, we're just lucky that Herod and Pontius Pilate showed up. No, because let's face it, Herod and Pontius Pilate are making political decisions, right? And the political context is what the political context would be, and 99 out of 100 people were going to make the same decision. And if this one guy, if like I need someone to be in this place who's willing to condemn Jesus, and Pontius Pilate was the guy that was actually going to stand up and defend him, like the one guy that actually would have not made that politically rational decision, then God could have replaced him like a week beforehand and put another guy in there, because there were lots of available Roman centurions that would have put Jesus to death. Like most of them would have. And he wasn't a centurion, but like there would have been lots of available governors that would have been there and would have done exactly what Pontius Pilate did. It wasn't luck. He just said, all right, these are the guys available. That's the guy that will work. I'll put him there, and he is going to do what I need him to do.
Right.
So there isn't this requirement of being shocked. I mean, it just doesn't really make sense. And George, that we're going to play in a little bit, I mean, he basically nails the simple foreknowledge view. When we actually get to that clip, the way that he describes it, like, yeah, that's the way most simple foreknowledge people would describe it. Not everyone, because there isn't in every position within it, but the way that most of us would describe it is the way that George describes it.
Right. So for my part, I agree with what you're saying. And I guess I would say that going back to when I answered Amber's question in terms of, well, how does Arminian Providence work? Oftentimes it's talking about permission versus prevention, right? Mm-hmm. And so in this case, there was people that were gathered against Jesus. And what does it say was predestined to take place?
The plan.
The plan. And they were gathered to do that plan. They're going to carry out that plan. So what exactly is the plan? The plan is the crucifixion. And God knows that they would do that.
Yeah.
Right? And not just knows it, permits it. Mm-hmm. Why? Because he wants to achieve the greatest possible good, which is redemption. But it's like the verse in Acts 2:23 talks about this Jesus delivered up according to the definitive plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Okay,
Yeah.
so for starters, you have God's plan and you have God's foreknowledge, but they're different, right? So it's
Yeah.
not that God determined everything. He foreknows some parts, he determined some parts. But what is being talked about here? That the handing of Jesus over is God's definitive plan.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens? They crucify him. They don't hand him over and then they let Jesus go. No, God knows that they're going to crucify him. So
And it is important for everyone to remember we're talking about logical priority, not chronological priority, because
Yes.
God knows all things from the beginning, so he has complete and absolute foreknowledge of things. But we're talking about the logical order of providence. Just wanted to reiterate that.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So you said something earlier that I wanted to touch on too, because you said, well, William Lane Craig wants to go back to the very before the foundation of the world and lay everything out kind of flat, and it's this world versus that world. So you got this possible world and that possible world. But I think it's important that we don't take these worlds and make them round. They need to be flat. They need to be timelines. And the order of events matters, and not because of chronology, but because the things that happen before explain what happens next, and then that explains what happens next. And so it is important that the way Judas started acting, he became the type of person that would betray Jesus. And Pilate became the type of person that would capitulate to certain arguments. And the Jews became the type of people that wanted to set up the plot and that sort of thing. And although you're absolutely right, we can't lose sight of the fact that God knows the beginning from the end, the first to the last, and everything like that. Yes, he knows it from the beginning. But that doesn't mean that the interconnected parts don't have a logical relationship to each other, even in God's earlier foreknowledge. And if we lose that sequence, better. If you reverse the sequence. Okay, so let's say, and this is where Molinists can become non-Arminian Molinists. They can become Calvinist Molinists by reversing the sequence. Because if you say, well, the end is the absolute goal, and then God just comes up with a way to get to that end, then you got a problem. So if let's say God decides, well, I'm going to make sure that this person sins. That's kind of like his absolute end goal. And then he finds the temptation, and that temptation didn't work. So I need a better temptation to get him to sin. That's not the Arminian view of divine providence. And the reason why is because it's against what I understand, what hopefully most Arminians would understand to be the character of God, his holiness. Now, but at the same time, what we don't do is say, well, then God doesn't know, because God could use his power in the same way, right? But he doesn't use his power inappropriately because he's God, because he's good.
Yeah.
In the same way, he doesn't use his knowledge to manipulate people into evil.
But what he does do sometimes is to manipulate people into certain expressions of their evil, but not to evil itself. So it's like, all right, did God predestine Pontius Pilate? No. God predestined the governor of Judea was going to do this. And when in terms of logical order, it became like, okay, who's going to be the available guy to be governor of Judea during this time? Who will do this? He selected Pontius Pilate and made sure that he was the one who was there in that position at that time. But that's very, very different than simply saying, all right, I'm going to ensure that Pontius Pilate himself, that this is going to be the guy, and that he is going to be willing to do it when the time comes. That's a very different way of thinking about it.
It is, yeah.
And it seemed like one of the problems that causal thinkers have, and Craig is a causal thinker, is that they forget that people are people, and they start thinking about people in terms of like cogs and machines. And Craig manages to avoid doing that completely, but I think he's accidentally doing it in this kind of case when he's thinking about Pilate and Herod, and he's not treating them as humans, but instead treating them as like, okay, God determined that it's going to be Herod who does this, therefore he ensures that Herod is going to be the kind of person who will do it. No, God needed the false king of Judea to do this, and he manipulated things so that a king, whoever was going to be king, was going to be the kind of guy who would do it. That's the way that he does it, and it's very important to understand that. Very important to understand that.
Yeah. So, right. Well, actually, that kind of sets up for the next clip very nicely. You want to move on to the next clip from William Lane Craig here?
We've basically been responding to it for the past 10 minutes. So yeah, let's actually watch it.
Sure.
This is George. I mentioned George before. So let's.
Yeah.
Just questioning. And this speech that is quoted in Acts 4 is after Christ's resurrection, after the ascension. And could the Arminians say, well, God did not have to foreknow Pontius Pilate and Herod doing these things in terms of Jesus' crucifixion in order to predestine or preordain that.
Mhm.
Instead, logically prior to creation, God had determined that he would implement a redemptive plan. These circumstances occurred later, and looking back, these people here are looking backwards. Now we can say that this was foreordained because God chose those circumstances at that time to implement his plan. He didn't have to foreknow these people logically prior to creation. Could the Arminians say that?
Well, it seems to me that he would. It says that they were gathered together to do whatever thy hand and thy plan had predestined to take place. Well, how can people be predestined to do something if God doesn't even know that those people would exist or doesn't know what they would do?
But couldn't you have just predestination of the general contours without the specific people?
Yes, you could say that God causally determines the sort of broad circumstances and then lets agents run free within that. But that's why a verse like this one is so striking, George, is that it is so specific that you have not only the Jewish nation and the Roman Empire, but by name, Pilate and Herod were all planned out by God and predestined to do what they did in crucifying Jesus. This is not just setting the sort of general contours of history. This is knowledge that is so specific that it cries out for some sort of explanation as to how God could plan something so contingent to happen.
Just to follow up on that question,
Mhm.
This is more of a fundamental and
So actually, I guess that was the bit. So I guess I know you've already talked about that a little bit, but do you want to comment a bit more on the idea of the predestination of the contours of a plan versus all the specific details? Oh, I'm sorry, I've lost your volume.
Sorry, I have a mute button here that I'm using. So you can kind of think of like, okay, guys, we're going to get there, and when we do, we're going to probably people are going to be here. Like you can kind of imagine like being a Secret Service agent, right? And you're trying to protect the president.
Too soon.
Yeah, I know. I was actually thinking of JFK, not the recent events. for those who are in future times watching this, President Trump was shot today, so that's probably not the best example for me to have used, and I apologize for that. But all right, well, imagine that you're taking care of Taylor Swift, all right, and say, okay, we're going to go to this concert, and when we do, there's going to be a whole bunch of people that are going to be here, and someone's going to come up and want to take a picture, and someone's going to want to come up and do this, and then when we get inside, we're going to talk to the manager, and we're going to ensure that this happens and this happens, and then we're going to talk to the backstage person. We're going to. You don't know what the name of the manager is necessarily. I mean, you might, but you don't necessarily need to know the name of the manager to know that you need to talk to the manager. You don't have to know who the backstage coordinator is to know that you have to talk to the backstage coordinator. You don't have to know the names of every single person in the crowd to be able to predict what a Swiftie is going to do on any particular day. You know, you have a general understanding of how human beings behave. You know, so yeah, you can actually plan certain contours and say that, yeah, the governor of Judea is going to do this, and the king of Judea is going to do this. And if the governor of Judea isn't going to do this, I can replace the governor of Judea and make him somebody else. Same thing with the king of Judea. A little harder with the king, but it's still possible. There are ways of doing this. I do admit that I do think God had a lot more coordination in making sure that the Roman Empire was where it was and doing what it was doing at that particular time when Christ was sent. I agree with that. But there's a big difference between guiding the course of a nation and controlling individual people. You know, the interesting thing about human beings is that it is actually relatively difficult to predict what an individual would do, but it's very easy to predict what humans generally are going to do. That's actually quite simple. And being able to ensure that the right people are in the right places at a particular given time does not require the predestining of human beings' choices. It's not actually required. It's just finding the right people at the right time when they're needed and putting them in the places where you need to have them. You know, and it really isn't all that complicated when you actually think about the way humans work.
Yeah, I like that point. I mean, so God, let's say God predestined the crucifixion, determined it such that it wasn't going to be avoided. It was that was necessary because of God's plan for that, because he determined it. That doesn't mean that everything else, that he's got no way of controlling it, because the only thing that God can ever do to influence the future is predestination, you know, or predeterminism. So he's got a wide array of ways of influencing, controlling things. And he knows what's going to happen from the get-go, from the creation of the world. And he not only knows what is going to happen, but he knows what would happen under different circumstances for people like Pilate, for Judas, for the Sanhedrin, and whoever, based on the way things are, and based on who they are and their characteristics and that sort of thing. And he can use those means without having to resort to only predeterminism.
Yeah, it's like Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot didn't betray Jesus because he was one of the 12. He was one of the 12 because he was going to betray Jesus.
Right.
You know, and that if Judas wasn't the kind of guy that would betray Jesus, Jesus would have selected a different 12th guy.
Right, right.
You know, it's yeah. The other interesting thing that's worth pointing out about is that when Arminians talk about God's foreknowledge, because we're a soteriological system, 9 times out of 10, what we're talking about is whether a person's going to heaven or hell, and that specific sense of predestination. Usually when we're thinking about divine providence, Arminians are just simply saying, well, yeah, God ordains things. He just does things. He's active in the world. He makes sure that what it is that he wants comes to pass. Usually when we're talking about God predestining a person based off of his foreknowledge, we're talking about it in terms of salvation. And that's usually when we're utilizing the language. I mean, it's appropriate to use the language in this broader context of predestination. It's not wrong, but it's not when we're typically using the words.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, there's predestination of specific events, and then there's predestination of people, God's church, believers.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, and those are separate. So the language in Ephesians 1 about predestination is about God's people, his church.
Which is the same word here, though. So
it is, yes. And right, I think Romans 1:4 talks about that Christ was foreordained or ordained, basically that he was, yeah. So absolutely. So the what I think the point is, there's predestination about a general event versus predestination about salvation, and those are different categories. There's a lot of connection, a lot of overlap, but it's important to keep those distinct. Yes.
Yeah, and usually when we're talking about the Arminians in particular, we're usually talking about the salvation thing, because Arminians aren't that defined when it comes to general providence. We allow things to be a lot more open, because it's just not the focus of Arminianism. We're focused on salvation.
Right. And so when it comes to, there's Arminian Molinists and then there's non-Arminian Molinists, this is usually the core issue, because if a Molinist says, well, God unconditionally elects some people to heaven and either passes by or reprobates other people to hell, and then he consults his middle knowledge and figures out how to do that. Like, okay, so you imagine like God's grace, like calling, right? The calling is like a volume dial for the calling, right? And so for the people that he elects, he dials the volume way up to make sure that they convert. And then for the people that he doesn't elect, he dials the volume way down to make sure that they don't convert, or something like that. That type of view is completely inconsistent with Arminianism. But Molinists don't have to go down that road. Now, if they're a Calvinist Molinist, they might try an approach like that, or it's something to try to explain election and how that works. But an Arminian Molinist is going to say, no, the problem with that is the sequencing, the order here. It's that God loves everybody. He wants everyone to be saved, and he's going to call everybody. Now, yes, he knows some people won't call, and so some people will say no, but he calls them anyways because he wants to give them that opportunity, even knowing that they won't. And he still has a greater good that he's going to bring out of the overall world, and that's just part of his plan. But it's not that God manipulates his calling. No, he's giving everyone sufficient grace so that they can believe, and that's what's important.
And I would also say that God is usually a lot more manipulative when it comes to general providence. I mean, he says that the heart of the king is in the hand of God, and he twists it wherever it needs to turn. There is a sense in where I do think God is more willing to influence an individual's will when it comes to the manifestation of general events. But it's never a salvific point. It's never like he was willing to manipulate a sinner to manifest his sin in a particular way to ensure events happen the way they're supposed to, but he won't make that person a sinner. Right? He won't, and which means that all he really needs in terms of government, he just needs a reprobate there. That's all he needs. Once he's in a reprobate, he can make the reprobate do what he wants to do. It becomes a lot simpler. So I don't think it's, and you can kind of hear it in the way that I talk about things. Like, hey, maybe this, maybe this, maybe this. I'm not that specific about things because I don't think I have to be. It's just, I just know what God gets done, and I just need to believe that he gets it done.
Right. Yeah, that Proverbs 20, I think it's 21:1. So it's the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord, and he turns it wherever he wills, like the rivers of water.
Yeah.
Now water flows downhill
Yeah.
but you can dig an irrigation ditch and get the water to, it's not going to start going uphill, at least not for a very long distance or anything like that, but it's, you can direct it, you can guide it, and that sort of thing. And that's by the circumstances in front of the water, not by like changing the water into something else. He doesn't change the water into diamonds or, no, he guides the water by putting it in the right circumstances, knowing where it's going to go. Yeah. Okay. You ready for the next clip?
Yeah, sure. This is when we get more to the Greek. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
The word that is translated into.
Okay. Here, let me pull this up. All right, here we go.
To predestination is that it can be literally interpreted as knowing beforehand. Is that completely off base? Or
Yes.
Is that...
The word in the Greek for foreknow is prognosko, which means to foreknow, prognosko. But foreordination is pro-orizo. Sorry, putting omega there, which means foreordain. Orizo is to ordain something. So pro-orizo means to foreordain, or sometimes translated predestined. Now, what the Arminian will say is that God's foreordination is based on his foreknowledge. He looks into the future, sees what will happen, and then foreordains that will happen. And my criticism is that trivializes the doctrine of foreordination, because it just means that God declares that what will be, and that's a tautology. Of course, what will be. So there's got to be something more to this doctrine than that.
Yes, there has to be something more to the doctrine. Find out what that is. So it's not that God's preordination, it's not that God's declaration of what will be is based off of his foreknowledge. It's that God's interventions are based off of his foreknowledge. He decides when and how he is going to intervene based off of what he knows is going to happen. So and in that sense, his preordination is based off of that, because he knows what he's going to do before he does it. Because all of his actions, they are technically pre-planned before they happen, because he knows what's going to happen beforehand. So he creates the world, then he sees how the world's going to develop. He decides how he's going to act based off of what he sees. He knows what's going to happen because of what he's going to do, and then he just plans accordingly before it happens. It's not that complicated. And it really is. I mean, the problem is that he's failing to recognize that what we would be talking about is intervention, that his interventions are based off of his foreknowledge. And he's going to intervene to ensure that what he wants to accomplish happens.
Right. I think the important thing here is that when God knows somebody is going to be a believer, it's not just that he knows that, he chooses that person. Yeah. And that choice makes all the difference, because believing by itself is not going to get you to heaven. It's not like it's not like faith merits eternal life, and that's your ticket to heaven. Now you've earned salvation, and you've earned a ticket into the pearly gates through faith.
Got a lot more to say about that, but yep, I agree.
Yeah, so you've got new birth, you've got sanctification, you've got justification, adoption, all these great graces that come through God's choosing the person. So it is not a rubber stamp of what we already done or known to do.
Well, and we'll also remember, William Lane Craig is not talking about salvation here, which is one of his errors. His error is his failure to recognize that Arminians, as Arminians, are talking about salvation when we're talking about predestination based off of foreknowledge. So he's failing to recognize that we're talking in that category. He's not talking in that category. He's just talking about general providence. That's the only category he's actually discussing, which is something that Arminians are not definite about.
So maybe if I make a distinction that maybe would help. So let's say, back with Jacob Arminius and back then, they had less of a corporate focus. I'm not saying that they didn't have the seed idea of a corporate election then, but they had more of a foreknowledge. They had more of a foreknowledge-based election model. And a lot of the church fathers, frankly, had that as well, which is really interesting. But more modern Arminians still, at least some of them still hold to some type of foreknowledge-based election. Some don't, but most of them have a much bigger emphasis on corporate election. God's electing a people, a church, a nation, and that sort of thing. So if you look at it from just saying, let's say William Lane Craig is looking at it in terms of, well, God knows Bob is going to believe, and then God predestines that Bob will believe. No, that's not quite right. But the point is that when God predestines him, that changes everything for Bob from then on, right? Yeah. And his life is just radically and totally different, and that's a massive act of God's grace. And it's all done in advance because God foreknew. So even if you go with just the foreknowledge-based election view and set the corporate view to the side, it doesn't work that way. And by the way, most Arminians today have a very strong view of God's corporate election as well.
Yeah, and I would also, and when we're talking about this general providence thing. I mean, the idea, or in either scenario, this idea that it's a rubber stamp thing, it just really fails to understand how intervening God is, that he's intimately there, that he is involved. And the thing is that Craig knows that. He knows that God didn't just simply set up the dominoes and he set them off and then he's watched them go. He's not deist in the slightest. He absolutely believes in God's intervention. Well, so do we. And God's foreordination has to do with that, with the way that he's weaving in and out of history, when he weaves in and out of history, how he weaves in and out of history. That's what his foreordination is about. And the foreordination of people, like you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that I am the way that I am right now in this moment is because I have been regenerated, and I would not have been regenerated if God did not choose to regenerate me. If I had all the faith of Abraham in the world and God still decided to condemn me to hell, he would be in his full rights to do so. There is nothing about my faith which demands, which forces God to save me, which is what merit is. Merit is the idea that God has become obliged to pay me something. And there's nothing about faith which is obligatory on God. He has made certain promises, and so we're confident because of those promises, but he's not obliged. He has to actually make the conscious choice, yeah, I'm going to actually save Martin, but I'm going to do it because he has faith, but he still has to actually do it. He's not a machine. And I guess what frustrates me about Craig's presentation here is that I just feel like he should know this.
Yeah, so it almost seems like and I'm not trying to impute any motives on him, but to get Molinism to be the guy in the middle, right? You want Arminianism on one side, Calvinism on the other, and hey, here's Molinism in the middle. he's kind of moving Arminianism over a little bit to create a little bit of room in the middle. Now, in fairness to him, he, in the Four Views books that he's written, he was engaging David Hunt, who had a simple foreknowledge view. And there were times when David Hunt would argue, well, there is providential control through the simple foreknowledge view. And William Lane Craig would quickly try to refute him and argue back and say, no, it's not. So the example that David Hunt would give, because William Lane Craig would say, well, simple foreknowledge is providentially useless because it's logically too late. Once you foreknow the event, it's already settled and you can't change it. So no crying over spilled milk sort of thing. And David Hunt would say, well, that's not quite right. And the example David Hunt gave is paper, rock, scissors, Rochambeau, right? And he said, well, if God knows the future, then he can always win at paper, rock, scissors. This is a simple little example, but I think people can probably relate to that. And Craig would argue, well, it doesn't work that way. But it seems sound enough that, yeah, because God knows that somebody's going to throw a rock, and he can throw paper.
But also think about that, right? Because, like, okay, he can guarantee that he's always going to win. But in order to win, he has to play. Right?
Right. Yeah.
God intervenes. He's part of the process, and I that just strikes me as the key thing that Craig is missing. It's just
very good. Okay, ready for one more or another clip from William Lane Craig here?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. There we go.
Well, let's turn then to a...
Okay, now this will be Craig's Molinist account for Acts 4:28.
Molinist account of providence. If we take the biblical word for foreknowledge, prognosis, to encompass middle knowledge, then we can make perfect sense of God's providential planning of a world of free agents. For via his middle knowledge, God knew exactly which persons, if members of the Sanhedrin, would freely vote for Jesus' condemnation, which persons, if in Jerusalem, would freely demand Christ's death and favor the release of Barabbas, what Herod, if king, would freely do in reaction to Jesus, and what Pilate, if holding the prefecture of Palestine in AD 30, would freely do under the pressure of the Jewish leaders and the crowd. Knowing all of the possible circumstances and persons involved and the permutations of these, God decreed to create just those circumstances and just those people who would freely do what God willed to happen. And thus, as Luke insists, the whole scenario unfolded according to God's plan. Now, this is truly mind-boggling if you reflect on it. When you think that the existence of the various circumstances and the persons involved were themselves the result of myriads of prior choices on the part of these and other free agents, and that those in turn were predicated upon yet prior contingencies on and on into the past, then you quickly see that only an omniscient mind could providentially direct a world of free creatures toward his sovereignly established ends.
All right, I'll pause there. Do you mind if I go first on this one? I'm jumping at the bit. Okay. So I would call this the soda straw fallacy. So you got all of human history, all of human events, and you're looking at these events in a soda straw, and you're saying, okay, well, there's the crucifixion, and oh, there's the betrayal, and I can see the Sanhedrin and Pilate. And then it's as if God predestines that in isolation of everything that came before, and then being shocked that all these things came before. Oh, wow, it lines up. Isn't that great? Or we're saying, well, there's manipulation to get it there, to get to the events that we view through the soda straw. And if God just kind of arranges all of human history just to get to this one event that he's seen through the soda straw. And that's a problem, because on at least the way I say it, and I do not speak for all Arminians for sure, but at least the way I say it is these events are building within God's plan. The one thing starts to explain the next to explain the next. So because of the fall, then we have the sacrifice of the lamb, and you have Abraham, and you have David, and all these stuff. And it's all building up, and the prior events help set the foundation and explain those next events. So they're all connected, and it moves forward. Chronologically, obviously, it moves forward, but even logically, in explaining the kind of the construction of the plan, it moves forward. I'm not saying that God doesn't have end goals, but he can achieve his end goals in lots and lots and lots of different ways. So, in terms of how he achieves those goals, how does he get there? How does he glorify himself and reveal himself and all these things? It's that as events unfold in time, they explain the next events, and that's both chronological and logical, and it explains how that plan came to be, what it was. And of course, God can intervene, he can make changes, he can manipulate, he can determine things unilaterally, he can permit, prevent, whatever is whatever he wants to do, of course, but that helps explain it. So again, the point isn't he sees this end point of the cross and then arranges the whole business just to get there. No, it's based on everything that came up. That's why it happened the way it did. So.
Yeah, and because what was required, if you really think about it, what was required was that Christ would die as a sacrifice. And thus what needed to be predestined primarily was the Jewish sacrificial system, and for the Jews to be in a particular scenario, such as what they had with Rome. And God could have had a different empire than Rome serve that role. He could have had different guy other than Pontius Pilate be the governor. But the truth of the matter is, and this is an important thing to remember, if anybody other than the real Son of God said the things that Jesus said, they would have been right to have crucified him. I mean, that's to some degree. I mean, according to the law.
If he wasn't God, yes. He's claiming to be God, so yeah, if he wasn't God, that's not
because
good.
he actually is God incarnate.
Right.
Jesus could say the things that he said. But if anybody other than Jesus said the things that he said, then it would have actually been blasphemy. And they didn't know that he was in fact the Son of God because he wasn't their sheep, because they weren't his sheep. Because they weren't his sheep, they didn't recognize his voice. And because they didn't recognize his voice, they crucified him. How many generations of Pharisees would actually have not crucified Christ? How many governors of Rome actually would not have succumbed to Caiaphas? My guess is an incredible few.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Christ just tells the Pharisees, "You fill up the measure of your fathers always." Right? Like they specifically said, "Well, we wouldn't sin like our fathers did," and he said, "No, you would." Yeah.
You were sinning just like your fathers did, just like your fathers always have, just like your sons always will, because you're humans. I mean, if Jesus wanted to wait for a different time period, he could have. He picked this time period for a few reasons. You could look at the timing of Rome, saying this was an opportune moment for Jesus to have come. And I think that's absolutely true. I think that there was providential choice. I think there was intention in Jesus coming when he came. Absolutely. But I don't think it's as fantastic as Craig is making it sound, that all these things lined up, because I think that all of them basically, like, you throw an actual son of God in the midst of human politics, people are going to react, and they're going to react violently because they hate the truth. You shine a light on a bunch of cockroaches, you know what the cockroaches are going to do. To paraphrase John a little bit there. You know, it's not that shocking. And
Now, for the sake of discussion, though, I mean, I think it goes back to the bigger picture question that we were talking about before. Even if everything that Craig said is true, he still can hold to Arminian soteriology, and probably does. Yeah. So, but you know, I guess I think that it is possible, and sometimes happens, that people use Molinism to explain things in a way that I see as problematic based on God's character, based on the fact that he's good, that he loves people, that he wants all to be saved, and that sort of thing. Now, Craig, Craig hasn't done that. He's not saying that he wants people to be lost. He's reprobating people and stuff like that. But some people do go there, and so I think that's the reason why I want to push back. Not that Craig has done anything horrific here or anything like that. It's just that, unfortunately, I think people take what he's saying here and then put it into the wrong context of, well, God chose to send this person to hell, and so now he's going to find the circumstances in which to make sure that the guy ends up in hell, or something like that.
Yeah. Which I don't think Craig would actually say. I think he would fall short of that.
Wouldn't.
Yeah. I mean, he's only willing to say this in terms of general providence. And in terms of general providence, I'm much more comfortable talking about God manipulating things than I am when it comes to individual salvation, because I'm an Arminian and he's an Arminian, and that's how we are. And I lost my train of thought. All right.
So, real quick, so I did have one more clip queued up, but there was actually a couple questions that came in. So let's see if we can take a few of these so that we have the other Caleb. Hey, Caleb. Recently, I heard that Arminius and Calvin actually didn't disagree on providence, philosophically speaking. I'm not sure if that's true, but I've seen some quotes from a Calvin affirming permission within God's providence, just as permission that is done with direct intention. Many classical Calvinists that I know affirm permission just with an intent or an end. John Calvin himself said point blank that be careful with the word permission, as if it's some type of bare permission, as if God wasn't behind it. And I think to me, the clearest example that you can see from Calvinists today, and even from historic Calvinists also, is when they explain God's foreknowledge. Because what Calvinists will say is God can't know the future unless he determines the future. That's a shocking claim. Like, that they understand how God could know the future or not. Yeah. Jesus Christ literally says, he tells the future, and then he says, I'm telling you so that when it happens, you'll know that I am he, right? It's proof that he's God. How did God create the world out of nothing, right? We don't need to dumb that down. We don't need to put that into human terms. So, but the point I'm making is, if the theistic determinist is going to say God can't know the future unless he's already determined what that future event is, then in what sense is he permitting it? That is a real clash because God has taken action to determine what the future will be, and yet it's in some sense permitted. And it
So,
can only
yeah.
be in some very relative sense. What Calvinists will say is, well, God determines the future, using let's say the evil in a person's heart, and he knows that the person's going to do evil, and he permits him to do it rather than causing them to do it. And the asymmetry they see is, well, in regeneration, God works a miracle in the human heart, and that brings about good works. And there's no opposite miracle of making the evil person evil and making sure that they commit some specific sin or something like that. If that's all they mean is that there's asymmetry between regeneration and somebody sinning, okay, but you still have God determining them to sin, and he's the first cause of that sin, and he wouldn't even know that they would sin unless he determined it and was the first cause of that sin. So it really is a strange sense in which they can use the word permission at all.
Well, you can think of it this way, right? So let's say you have a tool that allows you to take over the control of a person's mind, and you have determined that John, who is driving a truck, is going to plow through a bunch of people for, of course, your glory. And you realize before he does it that he's going to do it anyway. So you don't use the device. That's permission. But then if he decided to not do it, then you use the device to make sure that he does it. That's not permission. And that ends up being the distinction. That's all right. So the question of permission is like, okay, sometimes God has to act and make them do it, and sometimes he doesn't have to act and make them do it. But he's always going to make sure that they do it. And that's not the same thing as what the Arminian is talking about when he's talking about permission. I mean, remember, you have to be careful when it comes to quotes, because two people can use the same word and mean different things by it. Like Paul and James, for instance, talking about justification. And like, remember, even Muslims claim that Jesus is the Messiah, but they don't mean what we mean by it. Right. So you have to be careful, because basically when Calvin is using the word permission, they're same word, not the same idea.
Right. So, and then Amber asks a question. Does he follow dynamic omniscience? And I assume, Amber, you mean, does William Lane Craig follow dynamic omniscience? Certainly the way John Saunders defined dynamic omniscience, the answer is just a straightforward no, because John Saunders defined dynamic omniscience basically, well, not basically, as open theism. And William Lane Craig is a Molinist. He holds God knows the whole future, and not just has simple foreknowledge of the future. He knows what would happen under other circumstances as well. So no. Now, I've heard that Idol Killer has defined dynamic omniscience slightly differently, where it's the idea of, well, if God changes at all, or his knowledge changes at all, then he's in dynamic omniscience. That's slightly different. That's different than John Sanders' definition of dynamic omniscience. Now, in that sense, the answer is yes and no. So William Lane Craig is still going to be radically different than Warren McGrew's open theistic model, because under open theism, God's knowledge is always expanding. He's learning more things as he goes. And William Lane Craig is absolutely not. So God doesn't have, William Lane Craig would deny dynamic omniscience in that standpoint. But here's the yes part. And I'll try to, this is hard to explain, but William Lane Craig's model of time is this. He says, before creation, or sans creation, without creation, when it's God just by himself, that there is no such thing as time. And then when God creates the world, time comes into effect, that time exists, and God is now in time. Not that God doesn't transcend time in some other ways. I'm sure Craig would say that, but he's within time once he's created time. Okay. In that case, you could, if we sat down with William Lane Craig and a cup of coffee and say, does God know what time it is? And it is, 10:15. And then a minute later, does God know that it's now 10:16? And the answer might be yes. Now,
It would actually be yes. He has explicitly said that.
Yeah. So in that sense, if that's all that dynamic omniscience means, then yes. But that is radically different than the idea of God learning new things and his body of knowledge is expanding. And so I think it's unhelpful for me to just say yes. I think it's better to distinguish because there's such differences there.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of similar to the point that I made before about terms. Like, the most important thing about terms is that you know what they mean. And if this term is debated among different people, that just asking the question as asked isn't helpful. I'm unfamiliar with this particular term, so I couldn't even say yes or no. I certainly know what open theism is, but I haven't heard this particular wording before. But I would certainly say that to some degree, Craig would, and this may be completely off base, but Craig would say that the determination of God's knowledge is to some degree the object that he knows, right? So he is an objectivist on the knowledge. So it's not that God determines whether or not the object falls. He knows that the object's going to fall because it's going to fall. It's the object that makes it true, not God's knowledge of it that makes it true. Which means that when you are knowing things before they happen, the reason why he knows this is going to happen is because it's going to happen. So there is a sense in which his knowledge is contingent upon what the actual outcomes are going to be. If that's what you mean by it, well then, yeah, everyone except the Calvinist is going to say yes to that. But if what you're meaning by it is the idea that, like an open theist view, where God doesn't actually know what's going to happen and he's finding out as it happens and figuring some things out before they occur, but mostly just finding out as they happens, but he knows all true facts. No, he doesn't hold to that. That's open theism, and I don't hold to that either, and neither does Dan, and neither does I don't think any Arminian really holds to that.
Well, yeah, so think of the opposite of that. So the Calvinist view, where they're saying, so we're saying God, if I hold up my phone, right, I know my phone is here because my phone is here. The statement "my phone is here" is true because my phone is here, right?
Yeah.
But when Calvinists say the opposite, God doesn't know the future because he sees the future or foresees the future or something like that, but rather he knows himself.
Yeah.
So think of like a gigantic Outlook calendar that's got, you have your Outlook and you can put in there scheduled events for tomorrow, but God's Outlook calendar is just jam-packed and it has every detail for the entire universe. And he can look at his Outlook calendar and he knows everything that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If you look at your Outlook calendar, that's different than knowing the events. It's just knowing your plan for the events. And so, for example, to give another illustration, let's say I can calculate when Halley's Comet will return because I can do the math, and I can't. But let's say somebody can do the math and they can calculate, okay, Halley's Comet is going to be back 53 years from now, whatever the case is. That math equation, that's totally different than experiencing Halley's Comet, than watching Halley's Comet,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in the same way, if God just knows his Outlook calendar and not the events of tomorrow, in a very real sense, God doesn't have foreknowledge because he doesn't know. He's not experiencing Halley's Comet. He's
Mm-hmm.
just experiencing the math of when Halley's Comet will come. He's not experiencing the events on his calendar. He's just looking at his calendar, and that, to me, that's just a straight denial of God's foreknowledge, at least as far as I understand. God's it's not knowledge of the future.
Like, he hasn't. All right, so like whether or not he's experienced the future yet or not, it's going to depend on whether or not you're an atheist or a p-theorist. And another reason why I'm not a Molinist is that I'm a B theorist. So I do actually have a sense that God is experiencing what's going on 50 years from now. So in that, I mean, that's another place where I disagree with Craig. But with Craig, he does have this idea that experientially God's knowledge is always changing because he's in a new moment. He's in, and because he's in a new moment, his knowledge kind of updates. But it is just sort of, but he knows what the moment was going to be before it happens. Gotcha. Sort of like what is it you're describing. And on the A theory view of foreknowledge, yeah, that has to be true. Now I'm a B theorist, so I don't hold to that. But yeah, I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, I think I'm more of an atheist, but I certainly hold that past events has a causal effect on today, and today's events have a causal effect on the next moment. They so it has to kind of cohere together. Like it can't be just like this slice in time is the only thing that exists, because the past is still influential and the present is still. Anyways, not the point. But I am certainly sympathetic to the B theory position as well. But anyways, we'll go too far off the rails if we go that way. So cool. Well, thank you for the question, Caleb and Amber. And I did have one other clip, but if you want, we can get into it. But it's actually kind of off topic a little bit. I just thought it was fun.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, then maybe we can forego it because we have been going for about an hour.
Well, actually, I think it is. I think it's helpful in seeing what Craig's mindset is, because I was talking before about the ironic mindset of Molina, and I think that this is a demonstration of that. So I do think there's some value in it.
Okay, let's do it then. All right, let me
chapter direct.
All right, here we go.
Here's entitled "Molinism Saves Marriages." And he tells this story. He says, my wife and I used to fight about a certain subject all too often. This issue that caused such tension between the two of us was regarding a theological issue, God's sovereignty and human freedom. That is to say, my wife held to a theological view known as Arminianism, and I was a staunch Calvinist. Churches split over this debate, and our fledgling relationship was on the rocks because of it too. This topic would constantly arise, and it seemed as if every night we would go get our Bibles, not to grow closer to God, but to use them as weapons against each other. She had her proof texts, and I had mine. We would have yelling fights that would lead to tears. In retrospect, I was a total jerk. But I figured that God had causally determined me to be a jerk, and that he was forcing me to act that way for some reason, unbeknownst to me. We finally decided to sweep this problem under the rug, and we got married despite being unequally yoked with theological differences. However, the problem remained. Deep down, I actually questioned her salvation, as I could not understand why God would not force her to believe the truth, as I was confident he did with me. After several years of not talking about this issue, God finally intervened. At the same time, I was studying Christian apologetics. Ironically, a Calvinistic pastoral colleague of mine introduced me to the work of William Lane Craig. Pretty soon, I stumbled upon the doctrines of middle knowledge and Molinism. It soon occurred to me that the dichotomy between Calvinism and Arminianism is a false one. That is to say, there is at least one other possible option to consider: Molinism. Molinism clicked and made sense to me. It has been several years since I parted ways with Calvin. My wife and I are both advocates of Molinism today, and our marriage is flourishing. Rarely a week goes by, however, that my wife does not lovingly remind me that she was right and I was wrong about the faults of Calvinism. Bottom line, Molinism saves marriages. Well, we can be.
Okay.
Molinism provides a causal understanding to help a causal thinker to embrace Arminianism. That's what happened. Because he rejects tulip, right? So what salvation does this guy now have? What is his view of soteriology now? I guarantee you it is something very much akin to Arminianism.
Right.
You know, like what? So here he is. Craig is claiming, look, here is the proof that this is the irenic position. This is the position between Arminianism and Calvinism. But it isn't, because it's not a soteriological point. I bet she hasn't changed a single soteriological position.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't sound like it at all.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, what was it that she was wrong about?
Yeah. You know, I think one thing I find helpful is that, and I find helpful about SCA in general, is that let's say somebody is in Calvinism, but they're struggling with it, but they don't know what's next, right? Okay, so if they're Calvinists, but they're starting to see it's starting to fray around the edges, but they're kind of scared, and well, what are the options out there? And if they think it's either Calvinism or open theism, they might be really hesitant. And yeah, maybe becoming a Molinist or a simple foreknowledge is a whole lot better. And they would say, okay, yeah, because there's probably things that they've seen in Scripture that make them not want to go so far. Or on the soteriological side, they look at the provisionist position and say, well, I'm not really comfortable that they have that seems too far. And well, Arminians hold to total depravity and prevenient grace or something like that. So I do appreciate the overall point of, if somebody is struggling with Calvinism, but they also they want a kind of a moderate option because they have seen some truth and some beneficial aspects in Calvinism, but they realize that there's problems. They can find a soteriology that is soundly biblical, and if their model of providence, if that's what they see in Scripture, of a very strong model of providence, great. Become an Arminian Molinist. Why not?
Yeah.
And
yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah. Now, I'm also not qualified to give marriage advice, but my goodness, that kind of cracked me up, and I was like, ooh, that's trouble.
Well, yeah, and we also have too much distance from them to be able to really comment on the marriage, and even me saying like, hey, she hasn't changed perspective. I'm saying I bet she hasn't, because he's rejected tulip. He explicitly says that. And here's, and like the last time I was on, I mentioned this before. Calvinists are causally centered. Arminians are relationally centered. And I've switched from using socially centered to relational centered because of Chris, who you also had on. He convinced me to switch over to that, because he's better with that kind of thing than I am. But the truth of the matter is that Arminians tend to think about things in terms of relationships and how people relate to each other and social categories when we're thinking things through. We think of sovereignty. We think of God as Father. We think of king-subject relationships. Our Calvinists think of sovereignty to think about God causing everything. We both think of sovereignty, but we think about it differently. Same thing with glory. Same thing with a lot of other kinds of concepts. But the interesting thing about Molinism is that Molinism actually is causally centered in how it's thinking about things. The way it's thinking about providence thinks about it in the same way that Calvinists think about things. While at the same time, it still ends up embracing, at least possibly embracing, Arminian soteriology. And it can put Arminian soteriology in epistemic terms that Calvinists can understand. And therefore, I do find Molinism to be very practical as far as that's concerned. So, like, you don't have to change your entire epistemology. Just understand Arminianism this way, and you will still embrace the correct biblical soteriology. Because my view of providence is that it's speculative. My view of soteriology is that it's biblical. And therefore, we've got to be right about the Bible stuff. We've got to be right on the salvation stuff. But the providential stuff, I just trust God to control things the way he's going to control them. Like, I don't have to know how that works, but I do have to know, at least on some level, how salvation works.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And like I said, I mean, from my standpoint as a Molinist, but an Arminian Molinist, the main thing for me is, the character of God, that he's good, that he's loving, that he's just, that he is holy, he is not the author of sin, and all that sort of thing. So if somebody is a Molinist and they're using Molinism to explain how God like orchestrated the fall as if that was his end goal, or uses it to reprobate people or to entrap people in sins and that sort of thing, that's not the Arminian view, and it doesn't quite fit within it. But if they don't do that, and they just say, well, God uses his middle knowledge in holy ways, in ways that are helpful and loving and beneficial and that sort of thing, then yeah, absolutely, then you can be an Arminian Molinist too. And I think that's frankly what Craig is in the big picture. I think he's just an Arminian Molinist, and I'm also very appreciative of his overall ministry. I mean, his apologetics approach. The one thing I really love about his approach is he is absolutely right. If you want to get involved in apologetics, you've got to understand Christian theology inside and out. And, he does a really good job of both debating externally against atheists and Muslims or whoever, but internally teaching churches Christian doctrine and theology so that they can defend their Christian faith. And I'm very appreciative of him and his approach and his articulation, and he's just genius level in lots of different ways. And when he goes against the Calvinist, oh man, that's just a thing of beauty.
Well, actually, to me, like, I get more excited when he goes against the atheists, but
Sure.
Because that's always my heart. My heart is always reaching the lost, and Calvinists are the wrong. They're not the lost, and that is a difference.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that's true.
But it is fun when I see him go against James White. That's
but to your point, so actually me personally, so my friend Turton-Fan and I, he's a Calvinist, but we're going to set our differences aside, and we're going to debate two Roman Catholic apologists, or one is Assyrian Church of the East, on sola fide, on justification by faith alone. And yes, Turton-Fan and I have very big differences with each other on all these things, because he's a Calvinist and I'm an Arminian. But when it comes to, are we justified by faith or faith and works, that our differences seem a lot smaller.
Yeah. And that's true of a lot of things. Like, people talk about how Christians disagree with each other on so much. We don't disagree on nearly as much as people think. I mean, try to find a Christian who doesn't think that Noah built an ark. Try to find a Christian who doesn't think that Jesus's mother was named Mary, or that his earthly father was named Joseph. I mean, we actually agree on the vast majority of stuff. It's just that the way humans work is that we're more likely to talk about the things that we disagree with, and they tend to come out stronger than the stuff that we agree with. I wrote a list once of everything that Arminians and Calvinists have in common, and the list was quite long. In fact, it was, and I was just talking about soteriology. I wasn't even talking about some other issues that we all agree. We're all Trinitarian. We're all, we have the same spectrum in terms of eschatology and all that other kind of stuff. That's not where the disagreements are. But even within soteriology, we agree on a lot, an awful lot. But the same thing is also true if I tried to break down the agreements between Calvinists and Catholics and Arminians and Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. And like, it isn't until you get into the actual heretical groups that the list of agreements starts shrinking. You know, and yeah, it's an easy mistake to make. It's a very easy mistake to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I have appreciated it. This has been great. I've been fascinated, but I think we probably should start wrapping up for the sake of time. But before we do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share on the overall picture of what we've talked about here, or anything else that's on your heart?
I'd just like to end on the main thrust of what we've been saying this entire time, that Arminianism is a soteriological position, not a position on providence. Calvinism is a soteriological position and not a position on providence. And certain views of providence are compatible with one and not compatible with another, but it's compatibility, not part of the belief. And I think it's more helpful to think about it that way anyway.
Yes, yeah, I appreciate that. Yep. Oh, very good. Thank you for this great episode. And for everybody out there, please be praying for our nation and our everything. It really was shocking what happened in the news with
2 people died,
attempt.
at least. Yeah.
It's horrific. It's horrific. And but we serve a sovereign God who is in control, and he I do feel very strongly that the answer is in Jesus Christ, and that he can change people. And so please be praying for our nation. And
that God will do with the nation as he will do with it. I mean, that's not even a prayer. That is what's going to happen. He will do with America as he will do with America. And I'm thankful for whatever that end may be, because I trust him.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And thanks to those that commented. And so just in there. So God be with you.
I'll be with you.